Thanks, Pam, and thanks for inviting me to be here. It's really nice to be able to do a gig without getting on an airplane, which I do way too often. Those of you that have heard me speak before are going to be a little bit surprised, I think, by what I'm saying and presenting, because usually when I get asked, particularly by Mike Martin and Tony Frank and others, to talk about higher education, it's about money. And I'm going to spend almost all of my time today talking about students and the reason that we're all here. I would make an observation about public policy in Colorado that it has historically been very, very institution-centric, and the questions before the House is how do you make public policy student-centric? And what I'm going to lay out for you is part of the background, I think, that at least provides you the basis for a conversation about that topic. So having said that, let me say a couple of things. One, Colorado is a little bit better than the national average as far as the education attainment of its young population. But the reality is, being a little bit above the U.S. average doesn't put us in really good stead internationally. United States is, I think, now 13th in the proportion of its young people who have a college education. We were 10th not long ago. We were also 15th not long ago. So we're making some international progress. But the reality is we've got a long ways to go. And the scary part about Colorado, when you look at the very right part of this, the young population is the least well-educated of the population in this state. The education attainment of 35-year-olds, 45-year-olds, 55-year-olds is better than the education levels of 25-year-olds. Colorado is headed in the wrong direction. The lieutenant governor mentioned that, and D.C. is not on here, but Colorado is a very well-educated state when you take a look at the entire population. But Colorado is a very well-educated population because us old folks got educated, not because we're doing such a wonderful job with young folks. And when you take a look at it, just remember that just because Colorado is well-educated doesn't mean that all of Colorado is well-educated. There are enormous variations in this state as far as college attainment of the adult population. Castilla County, less than 3% of the adult population have a college credential. Douglas County, almost 2/3. So enormous gaps geographically. And I'm going to bring the point up again later in my presentation. So when we talk about equity and some of those kinds of topics, there are yes, underrepresented groups. One of the underrepresented groups is in fact geographic. Colorado is less well educated than it was a decade ago as far as the 25 to 64-year-olds. One of the few states that has not made progress and in fact has taken a step backwards. It's gone up over the last 10 years among 25 to 34-year-olds, but not enough to offset the difference of those folks that have in the last 10 years exited the stage and taken an awful lot of educated talent with them. And the difference between young folks and old folks, again, in Colorado is one of the few states that's in a deficit position, not making progress. Iowa is the state that's made huge progress, and it's done it not because it's educating any more students than it ever did, it's finding ways to keep them home. Colorado is one of those states that has historically benefited from an awful lot of Iowans moving here. Not so much the case now. And We take a look at education attainment versus, and I use Massachusetts because it's the best educated state in the country, where Colorado looks very different from Massachusetts, a little bit at the graduate and professional level, but an awful lot of students start college in Colorado and don't finish. The proportion of the population that has some college, no degree, is higher than the U.S. average and way higher than Massachusetts. So one of the things to tuck into your thinking as you have your conversations today is how do you think much more seriously about serving that population that started, didn't finish, is in many ways low-hanging fruit as far as moving college attainment. And then the issue that the Lieutenant Governor mentioned very explicitly, Colorado has the second largest gap of any state in the U.S. education attainment levels between whites and underrepresented minorities. And by that, we're talking about blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans. 31%, huge. And it's the same for young adults, still 35%. And in the last year, or the last 10 years, in fact, the gap has gotten bigger, not smaller. In spite of everything we've said, all of the rhetoric about serving the population, we're doing less well now in the gap than we were a decade ago. %60 of the minority population stops at high school. 80% stop before they get any kind of college credential. Take a look at the gaps at the baccalaureate level. 3-to-1 in the proportion of the population that get a baccalaureate degree. 4-to-1 at the graduate and professional level. Not quite as bad at the associate level, but still huge. And again, remember that every single additional part of the population that's growing will be minority. 15 years from now, the population will have 100,000, 100+ thousand more young minorities. It will have, and in fact, a smaller Anglo population than it does now. So it's not just percentages, it's absolute numbers that will change over time. The Lieutenant Governor mentioned 1/3 of the school students are now minority. This just is another way of saying that. And oh, by the way, 85% of these minorities are found in 10 counties. And those 10 counties are all within 50 miles of where we're sitting or standing. These are not the rural counties. We're talking about all the counties where have big populations is where there are very large proportions of minority students. And almost, there may be one or two, Douglas County, I guess, but every one of these counties have institutions of higher education in them. It's not because there is absolutely no access that this is happening. We don't have to build new institutions to serve this population. Colorado's got high personal income, although not as high as it was a decade ago. In many ways, Colorado is on the downhill slide as far as competitiveness with the rest of the country and how well off it is. Back in 2000, it was like 3rd or 4th in the country. It's slipped considerably since then. And again, if you want to take a look at, Colorado's above the national average, but it's only a 400% discrepancy between Pitkin County and Bent County, or 300% between Mineral County and Bent County. So, you know, there's enormous variation in wealth within this state. And that picture is very consistent with the map that I showed you about education attainment. The low education attainment counties are also low income counties in the main. Colorado is right at the national average with regard to salaries for employed workers at all education levels. A little bit higher than the national average at the low end, interestingly. It's probably all Weld County now with high incomes for folks working in the oil patch or in the gas patch, if you will. You know, and it's that, having worked in North Dakota and elsewhere, is an interesting particular problem because you have an awful lot of young people, particularly males, finding really good jobs in that particular economy, and that will last as long as their bodies do, which is about 10 or 15 years. And then the question is, then what? You know, and it's very, very hard to convince them they ought to go to college when they can make nigh on to 6 digits working for Halliburton or one of those companies. But that is, you know, it's nice while you can get it, but it doesn't last that long. We've learned in North Dakota and elsewhere. One of the things we keep forgetting is not only does it pay you to have more education because the higher education leads to better incomes, but the other reality is more education you get, the more likely you are to have a job at all. And the scary part of this picture is 1/3 of the folks who have less than a high school education are not in the labor force, at least in the labor, not in the economy that we track. There's the underground economy that I'm sure they're part of. But the reality is that those that are not in the economy are taking from it in very substantial ways. They're in the correction system. They're in the social service system. They are heavily dependent on Medicaid. They drive up social costs at all kinds of, in every program we can think of. I use this picture to say a couple of things. One, Colorado is both high per capita income and high education attainment, but the other piece of it is almost every one of the states in the upper right-hand corner are states that one would describe as being high-tech states. They are states that have high orientation to a technology-based economy. And interestingly, amongst these states, while it plays in these leagues, Colorado does not do as well on the income side as lots of other states that are equally well educated. So part of that is the extent to which Colorado has a bifurcated economy. Very high income on one end, not so high on the other. Way up there on the new economy index, way up there on the percentage, although slightly below the national average, of the percentage of the workforce in management and professional occupations, but way up there in the percentage that have technology occupations. Britt can talk about Maryland being 2 states ahead. You know, Colorado has an economy that most states would love to have. This is Tony Carnevale's work from the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce. 3 years ago, he projected that Colorado was going to need a workforce with 67% of its employees having some form of post-secondary certification. So a certificate of value, an associate degree, a baccalaureate degree or higher. Remember, Colorado is somewhere around 40% now. And the goals, I think, of the department are 60%. And it's 60% of 25 to 34-year-olds. If you take a look at it, this is 25 to 64-year-olds. And if you play this out to 2025, you can assume that there's about a 70% requirement. This is going to do nothing but go up. So if anything, your aggressive goal is low. And when you take a look at it, one of the interesting parts of this, and I think this, again, reflects a part of the oil and gas economy. There will be jobs for folks without much education. But what is interesting is the negative number around some college, no degree, and the very large increase in requirements for associate degree. And what is happening is in most economies, the requirements for certification in areas where that didn't used to be. That lots of folks that are out there, some college, no degree, are going to find themselves having to have some form of college credential in the coming economies. That just having been to college won't cut it without something that says there's certification of learning that matters. And when we think about adults, I want to put a couple of numbers on the table for you. It's really important to think about certifications and associate degrees. If one puts off going to college by 1 year after you leave high school, the probabilities of getting a baccalaureate degree drop 30%. These are national numbers. If you put them off and don't start college till you're 25, the probabilities of ever getting a baccalaureate degree, big numbers, 3%. But the probabilities of getting a certificate move to about 40%. The reality is that adults come to college for very explicit pocketbook reasons. And they want programs that can be delivered in a hurry and that give them a leg up an economic ladder. And that means that we not only have to think about serving adults, but we have to think about serving them in a very different way than we have before. Different kinds of programs, different delivery modes. This is not your 18-year-old's delivery model. Colorado there are only 4 states in the country that have a smaller population of the degree holders that were born in the state. And then you wonder why it's so hard to get a bond issue passed. Okay, because there is so little allegiance amongst the voting population to Colorado institutions. Most of the folks that are working here that have baccalaureate degrees came from someplace else. And their alumni money goes to University of Kansas or the University of Iowa or someplace, but it doesn't go here. And Colorado is unusual in the extent to which associate degree holders are exactly the same. Associate degree holders tend to stay closer to home, to be much more place-bound than baccalaureate degree holders. The picture is exactly the same among associate degree holders as it is among baccalaureate degree holders in this state. The Colorado paradox is partially explained. Even over the years when the economy was in the toilet, Colorado imported a lot of outside folks into its economy. But it also, and a lot of these were educated folks. A lot of them were not. Colorado imported solutions and it imported problems at the same time. And when you take a look at where high school graduate numbers are going, not going to be much growth. What growth there is will be minority. The white population is flat, going downhill some. And Colorado, interestingly, for all of its education attainment, the proportion of high school students going directly to college is amongst the lowest in the country. And this is going to college, not just in Colorado, anywhere in the U.S. So a lot of kids getting out of high school and not going anywhere to college. Slightly less than the national average stay in state to go to college. And those that go out of state go to very predictable places. They go next door, they go to Arizona, they go to Utah, and interestingly, large numbers of them go to proprietary schools of some sort, proprietary, online, and et cetera, including freshmen. These are freshmen. These are not advanced students in any way. Colorado's high school graduation rate, bad as it is slightly better than the national average. College going rate, way below the national average. 20 points below Massachusetts, or the average of the top states, Massachusetts, New Jersey, a couple others. And probably more concerning is the throughput rate, the extent to which students who go into college come out of college. And it's lower than the national average in every public sector. It's half of the best in the two-year institutions, 2/3 in the public master's, baccalaureate institutions, 80% of the best in the research universities. So an awful lot of progress in far as degree attainment is found in the retention process, not the recruitment process. Take a look at the slightly older population. Colorado gets more than the national average into college relative to the size of the population eligible. But again, if you take a look at this statewide, and these are 4 or 5 years old data, we tried to get some more recent data, and what we got just didn't work. But the reality is that there's huge variation, again, county to county, about the proportion of students that go to college. And the really underrepresented parts of the state are the Eastern Plains and the Southwest. And if you break it down by type of institution, if you are on the Eastern Plains, the probabilities are very small that you're going to go to any four-year institution. You're going to go to a community college because that's what's there. And the reality is that most students are going to go to college close to home. And if you take a look at this institution by institution, that will be equally true of the major research universities in the state as it is of a community college. The reach is not that huge. When you take a look at where do 80% of the students come from, mine's probably more than most is a statewide institution, but Boulder, Fort Collins, and et cetera, get the bulk of their students off the Front Range. Mesa gets its off the western slope. I mean, it's true of all the four-year institutions. They're largely local, regional institutions. While Colorado has fewer of its students than the norm staying in state, except for the private nonprofit sector in Colorado, Colorado is still an import state. More students come to college in Colorado than leave to go to college by sector. The scary part, at least for the public research universities, is the extent which, it's dropped by half in the last decade. So Colorado is becoming less attractive to out-of-staters or less attractive to in-staters, one or the other, as time goes on. And interestingly, the big growth is in fact in the private not-for-profit sector. That's where the big balance of trade increase has in fact been found. And it's, almost 5 times what it was a decade ago. When you take a look at degree production, less than the national average as far as how many degrees relative to the population that needs them. And it goes up less than the national average by a factor of half. So Colorado hasn't moved the needle much in the last decade. Heavily oriented toward certificates, less than 1 year, much more than the national average. Less than the national average with regard to longer-term certificates and associate degrees. And when we start talking about certificates, we get into a very slippery slope, because the question is, what's a certificate? And what's a certificate of value? And when you see less than 1 year, you start to ask the question, is there economic value associated with it? And it's not to say that there are no short-term certificates that do have economic value, because there are lots that do. But the big numbers in this tend to be things like certified nursing assistants, large numbers that pay minimum wage, that are, an on-ramp to nowhere. Interestingly, if I do labor market analysis in most states, the single biggest requirement for a job that requires a short-term certification that pays a living wage, interestingly, is commercial driver's license, truck drivers. I go to Oregon, I go to Ohio, I go to all kinds of places. That particular field jumps up more than any other. Not because the skill level requirement is so high, the fact that you got to pass the drug test keeps so many folks out of that particular program. Colorado's slightly better than the national average with both STEM and health professions, but having said that, well, before I go the next step, put up here the importance of the private, for-profit, and not-for-profit sectors in both, particularly the master's levels and in the certification levels. So when you think about public policy, this is not just a public enterprise. The Lieutenant Governor mentioned that there are lots of private institutions that contribute to the workforce in this state. They can't be left out of the policy discussion. This is where Colorado comes a cropper. It's slightly above the national average with regard to production of STEM certificates and degrees, but relative to the size of its tech employment base, almost at the bottom of the list. So you produce more than the national average and not nearly enough. This drives importation as much as anything you could put your finger on. Health, on the other hand, quite high relative to the employment base in the health professions. You've seen this one before. The Lieutenant Governor mentioned it. Colorado gets a big bang for its buck as far as degrees produced relative to the money it spends. The problem is it doesn't spend enough. And I will argue, and I've argued before the legislature on multiple occasions, it's awfully hard to move up on this scale if you don't move over on this scale. It's awfully hard to get more degrees with no more investment. If you were North Dakota, you could. Given the amount of money they've got relative to performance, you can make an argument that they ought to be able to produce a lot more with the money they have. Colorado, I can't, with a straight face, say that that's the case. Same is true of the four-year institutions, less so of the two-year institutions. And one of the issues, you take a look at South Dakota, North Dakota up there, the institutions and the states that do really well on this metric are states where the two-year institutions are heavily vested in vocational programs. Students that enroll in two-year technical or vocational programs are much more likely to complete than students that enter college in general studies or liberal arts. Colorado is a high capacity, low effort tax state. It has more than normal taxable wealth. It taxes that wealth at a rate less than the national average. So it's, again, it's not like states like Tennessee that have very low tax rates and also lack, low wealth. This is a state that can afford it if it chooses to. Colorado's tuition, students pay an inordinate share of the state cost of running the enterprise. The only states that are higher are those states in the very northeast part of the country that historically have viewed their higher ed systems as private institutions. Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Delaware, all of them have a history, and in fact, places like Vermont started as private institutions. The legislature still thinks of them as private institutions. So amongst the institutions and the states that are historically oriented to the public sector, Colorado beats them all as far as how much it leans on students to pay the bill. This picture says it probably better than anything else. Things have changed a lot in a decade. A decade ago it was 50-50. Now it's 70-30. And there's a set of issues here, folks. I have said before that the students that have to come to the dance are going to be low income. They're going to be first generation. They're going to be students of color, and et cetera. We are asking them to finance their education very heavily on their own backs. This is a recipe that, this is a self-defeating recipe. You can't ratchet up to it and the price forever and bring in low-income students. It isn't going to work. Now you can continue to bring in a few Nebraskans and Kansans and folks from Wyoming and et cetera, but you are going to have a very class-distinct population in this state. There's going to be haves and have-nots. The haves are going to be out-of-staters. The have-nots are going to be in-staters. That's not a happy prospect as somebody who's lived here for 45 years. With regard to the need-based grant programs, Colorado is not bad, but it's a long ways from what it's going to take, given the picture that I just laid out. And again, it's heavily dependent on tuition, on a per student basis. This is not a shares basis now. This is on a per student basis. So it's not way over on the right because the overall amount of money is much less in Colorado than in most states. But still, much more dependent on tuition, below the national average on how much is spent per student on need-based aid. So it's worked itself into a high tuition, low aid condition without ever saying that that's what it was going to do. This is a set of annual changes, not a policy decision. And the final couple of slides I want to show is, and remind you, is that if you take the same price at the public research universities and then recognize the income base on which that has to be paid in the various counties, it is 3 times more affordable in Douglas County than it is in Castilla County to go to the University of Colorado or Colorado State or the School of Mines. An argument for need-based aid if there ever was one, because it's the only way that you even out discrepancies amongst family incomes, given the fact that there are 3-to-1, 4-to-1 variations in those incomes. The same price applied across the state leads to very different affordability indexes county to county. And it doesn't make any difference which sector we're talking about. You know, in the research universities, it takes 36% of a family income to pay a tuition. If you're in the low income, that drops to 25% in the 4-year non-research universities. But, you know, that's still a 300% swing from the poorest to the richest. So, with time to spare, I think we have time for conversation, questions, arguments, speeches posing as questions.
Speech is a question. What do you think about starting a campus in Douglas County?
That's not for me to say, sir. And I would say the following: it's not about starting a campus. Okay, is there a need that has to be served? That's the first question. And the second question is, what's the best way to serve it?
Actually, there are 2 campuses in Douglas County, one in Parker and one in Castle Rock for Arapahoe Community College.
So, I mean, but again, the question is not one of campus, it's one of program, it's one of who's not being served. And then the question, and I have argued, and it's the conversation here, I have argued in most other states. I'm spending a lot of time with Nancy Zimpher in New York right now. And the question is, how do you use the existing assets of the New York State public higher education system to serve all of New York? It's not a question of, they've got 64 campuses. It's not like they need more campuses. What they need is more service. And how do you deliver that? How do you take SUNY Albany and serve Plattsburgh? How do you take some of the community colleges and serve parts of the state that are less well provided with community colleges? And I have come to the conclusion, and it's one of the public policy issues in Colorado, and the lieutenant governor mentioned it, didn't say it this way, but until the funding mechanism rewards collaboration, there won't be any. Okay? This is not going to be something that happens nicely voluntarily. And so the real question is, how do you create a funding stream that, as North Dakota has done, as Oklahoma has done, as some other states, that say there's a pot of money, you get access to it only if you collaborate by bringing your program to this campus or vice versa. There has to be some policy incentive mechanism that puts it in the institution's self-interest to collaborate. And at the moment, when you take a look at 70% of the money coming to the enterprise from tuition, every institutional bone in, every bone in every institution's body says go get more students, not go collaborate to serve somebody else's student. And so, this is a public policy issue, not just, hail fellows, well-meant conversation, because you can have this conversation. If the public policy environment doesn't support collaboration, it ain't gonna happen. Enough of my speech. Is that an answer to your question, Mr. Jordan, sir? Brett.
Dennis, you may have been on one of your slides, but what is the state commitment at the state level to need-based financial aid in Colorado? And what has been, if it has such a program, what is its trend line? I couldn't quite see the slide.
It's below the national average. On a per student basis, less than $300 per FTE student. And it's about, it's a couple $100 below the national average per student.
And what's been the trend?
It's been up, and it was up this year. I think it went down 2 years ago, so it's been, it's been uneven. But there's not been an ongoing commitment to it. And one of, again, I was talking to Britt over breakfast this morning. I said, there are only 2 states that I know of, and we've been working with both of them. One is Oregon, one is Tennessee, that is taking a serious look at how they finance the kinds of goals that you have put out and they have put out. They've got goals very similar to yours. Oregon's is more aggressive. But they've raised the question, what combination of state aid to institutions, tuition policy, need-based aid policy, and institutional productivity enhancement, what combination of those factors give us the best chance of hitting our goal? And, it's an interesting exercise that isn't worked through yet. But one of the things that it certainly shows is that it takes much more nuance than most state policy is up to. It basically says you have to treat the research universities different from community colleges. You probably have to think seriously about shifting some of the state investment into need-based aid. It's going to end up in the institutions, but the reality is you can't get certain sets of students into the institutions without it. So how the state thinks about investing its resources in higher education, increasingly important. And I make a lot of finance speeches around the country, and the argument that I make is the smaller the state share, the more directive that money has to be. You know, the more investment specific it has to be, because it's the only way you overcome the natural tendencies of enrolling students, which is a huge enrollment-based funding model. In this state, more than most. Does that answer your kind of question, Brett? Yeah.
One of the things that we see nationwide is the number of students coming to a higher education institution who need remediation. And we see that at the community college level probably more than the universities. Now that certainly adds time to their program, cost to their program. And I wonder if you have some comments or some data which talks about how we might address the remediation issue and get the students through perhaps in a more timely fashion. And then if the other point I want to make was, when we talk about collaboration amongst higher education institutions, shouldn't there be also a lot of collaboration between the higher education and the K-12 systems?
Answer to the second question is yes. And Colorado has done better than most states, and it's still got a long ways to go in the understanding of what it means to be college ready. And in most states, this whole conversation about Common Core and everything else is progressing with no involvement from higher ed. And we can adopt all of the Common Core standards and et cetera. Students can knock the socks off of the assessments and still show up in college being deemed not ready for college. Not because they didn't do well on what they were supposed to do well on. There was a disconnect between an expectation coming out of high school and an expectation about what it means to be ready for college. And I fault the higher ed world on this one. Until higher ed steps up and says, here is a common assessment that we will use to indicate readiness for college as a way of signaling to every high school teacher in the state what that means, then higher education can't really complain about what K-12 is doing. So, I mean, if there's a place for a conversation, it's around, will Common Core deliver us college ready as we define it? And if not, we better get our oar in the water. So that's a part of it. The second thing about developmental ed, there is probably more conversation about that topic around the country than practically any other, because every state has this as a huge problem. And there are states that are coming at this in very different ways, and some of which I'm not sure how I feel about. But places like Tennessee have figured out very technology rich, but very supportive, high touch as well, ways of dealing with a population that needs developmental education. And some very simple things. I mean, one of the things that we're learning about developmental ed, it's no surprise that when students walk into most institutions not knowing they're going to have to take a placement exam, never having thought about it, get plunked down and told, you got this exam to take, and oh, by the way, it's really high stakes. It will determine whether you go into developmental ed or not. And there are states that are saying, okay, we are going to give this exam in the summer. We're going to do boot camp, and then we're going to give it again. They get rid of at least a third of the developmental ed requirements just by letting the students get ready. Okay, there's another piece that says, for those that come anywhere close to hitting the cutoff point, put them in degree or in credit-bearing courses with some more wraparound support service. Connecticut has pushed this further than anybody else. They basically have said there is no such thing as developmental ed in higher education, period. All students that come into higher education will go into credit-bearing courses. Higher education institutions figure out how much wraparound support service you got to get them so that they can be successful in those courses. Because we just know that developmental ed, as we've always done it, doesn't work. Almost nobody that starts there gets out of a program. So if we don't find a way to do that for credit early on, and in community colleges, Washington and other states have proved, put them in vocational programs, teach the developmental ed as part of a co-taught program, keep them interested in some things, they will get out. But we got to blow up developmental ed as we know it. Yeah, Senator?
So, what percentage of students that have to go into developmental ed go in because of math and the slightly higher level math versus language arts?
Probably 60% versus 40%. And one of the other things, by the way, is, if you talk to some of the folks who really are experts at math education, the Yuri Treismans of the world at UT Austin and others, there's a real backlash against Algebra 2 and kind of calc as the path that all students should take. And the whole question of moving into something that looks much more like statistics, that looks more like things that, in fact, folks will ever use if you're not going to be an engineer or a scientist. That the whole question of let's get math to be much more aligned with student need, interest, and intent gets rid of an awful lot of this.
So Dennis, we have blown up developmental education in Colorado, and we have separated it into STEM degrees versus non-STEM degrees, reduced the time to completion and done prerequisite courses, and collapsed the number of remedial courses that are necessary for a student to get through the sequence and done the boot camps, and have really worked hard on changing how we do developmental education. It's really in its early stages right now, so the results are going to take a couple of years to evaluate, and in fact our performance contract has for our system, so not for the other places that we say, but for the system of community colleges, and we have all those reforms in by fall 2016, but we're moving a lot quicker than that.
Yeah, one of the, and congratulations, by the way. It is the right issue, and it's the right issue particularly for the community colleges. If you want to take there's a document that the Complete College America put out called Time is the Enemy. Take a look at it, because one of the things that they've done for the states that are involved with them is take a look at the completion rates of students who start in developmental ed. It's the first time we've really had data about that. It is not something to warm your heart. It's 3%, 5%. Students that get into that track never come out of that track. Okay, time up.
Mine is less of a data question, more of a policy question that goes back to where the institutions are versus, and your reference particularly to the eastern, southeastern corner of the state. It seems to me it's not just a data question. It also is a jobs question, and I don't know that it makes a lot of sense to talk about them separately, because on the presumption that those who live out there will choose to stay out there, educating them also means having job opportunities in the same area. So I don't think we can do one without thinking about the other. What's the point? Unless they, of course, want to leave or move to where there are jobs. At least my background in data would suggest a degree out there with a 4-year degree won't afford them the opportunity to have an earnings level like that unless there are jobs out there. So how do you, I think it's a policy question. We have to have both. We can't educate them without in those areas, on the presumption they would like to stay in those areas, unless we find some, if you're sounding too business-oriented, President Foster, some opportunity for jobs for them as well. And I don't think we're addressing that yet. And I think we have to make it worthwhile and provide the right incentives for them to want to go to school.
Don Elliman couldn't have said it better. No, I mean, you're right. You know, this is not one of those things where it's, you know, where it really is chicken and egg. You can't do it one way or the other. It's got to be both and. Okay.